The icy wind howled through the frozen forest as a tiny German shepherd puppy, barely 2 months old, trembled in the snow. His owner's truck had long disappeared, leaving him abandoned, alone, and doomed to the merciless cold. His little body shivered, his breath growing weaker, until the shadows emerged from the blizzard. Glowing eyes surrounded him. A pack of hungry wolves. Would they tear him apart? Or did fate have something else in store? The wind howled through the dense pine forest, whipping against the towering trees and rattling their snow-laden branches. The blizzard had arrived earlier than expected, turning the mountain pass into a vast, frozen wasteland. The night sky, hidden behind thick, swirling clouds, gave no light, only the dim glow of a truck's headlights carved through the darkness, bouncing off the endless white. The truck skidded slightly as it came to a rough stop on the icy trail. Its engine rumbled low, a beast at rest in the storm. Inside, Gavin Mitchell, a lanky 20-year-old with sharp features and an even sharper temper, gripped the wheel so tightly that his fingers ached. His breath came out in short, angry bursts, fogging up the windshield. He had been seething for days, anger coiling inside him like a viper waiting to strike. Tonight, he was finally going to make Clara regret ever leaving him. She had broken up with him a week ago, and not in the way he had expected. He had thought she would cry, beg him to stay, ask him to fix things. Instead, she had cut him off completely, as if he had never meant anything. He had called her, she hadn't answered. He had shown up at her house, she had slammed the door in his face. And all because of that damn dog. His lips curled in disgust as he glanced at the passenger seat. A tiny German shepherd puppy, barely 2 months old, lay curled into a tight ball, his small body trembling. His black and tan fur was soft, his ears still slightly too large for his head. He was too young to understand what was happening, but he knew enough to be afraid. His name was Snow, the only survivor of his litter. His mother had died from an illness shortly after giving birth, and his siblings had not survived the first harsh week of winter. Snow had been the weakest of the litter, the one least expected to live, but against all odds he had, and Clara had loved him fiercely for it, but Gavin had never cared about any of that. To him, Snow was just another distraction, something that pulled Clara further away from him. He had seen it in her eyes, the way she lit up whenever she played with the pup, how she chose to stay home with Snow instead of going out with him. And when she had finally cut ties with him, she had chosen the damn dog over him too. That's why he was going to take that choice away from her. She had thrown him away. Fine, then he would throw away the one thing she loved most. Gavin reached over and grabbed the puppy roughly by the scruff of his neck. Snow let out a soft whimper, his tiny legs kicking weakly in the air. "Shut up," Gavin muttered, opening the door. The moment the door swung open, a gust of frigid wind slammed into them, cutting through his jacket like a knife. The blizzard raged outside, the snow thick and merciless. Perfect. Without a second thought, he threw the puppy out into the storm. Snow hit the frozen ground with a muffled thud, his small body sinking into the deep snow. For a second he didn't move, stunned by the sudden impact and the biting cold that immediately seeped through his fur. Then, with a desperate whimper, he tried to push himself up, his tiny paws slipping against the ice. Gavin watched from the doorway, his expression blank. He had thought about drowning the pup or leaving it somewhere on the road, but no, this was better. A slow smirk curled on his lips. "Let's see if you're as lucky as Clara thinks you are," he muttered. Then he slammed the door shut. The truck's engine roared as he pressed his foot down on the gas. The tires skidded slightly before catching traction, and within seconds the vehicle was moving again, its red taillights fading into the storm. Snow let out a tiny whimper. His ears twitched at the sound of the truck pulling away, and instinctively he stumbled forward, his body small, fragile, but still desperately trying to follow. His breath came in short, shallow puffs. His legs gave out. The truck was gone. The warmth of Clara's hands, the scent of her hair, the softness of her voice, they were gone too. Snow curled into himself, trying to hold on to whatever warmth was left in his small body. But the cold was too much. It pressed into him, seeped into his bones, stealing away what little strength he had left. His heartbeat slowed, his vision blurred. Then, a deep, rumbling growl pierced the wind. Snow's body tensed. Even in his half-conscious state, he could sense it. Something was watching him. Glowing yellow eyes, massive, looming shadows. Would they be his salvation or his end? The blizzard howled through the trees, swirling thick snow across the frozen ground. Snow lay motionless, his tiny body barely a speck in the vast white expanse. His breathing was shallow, his fur damp and clumped with ice. His fragile paws twitched slightly, his instincts urging him to move, to run, but there was nowhere to go. Then the forest came alive. Shadows flickered between the trees, silent but deliberate. A pack of wolves. Their bodies were built for this world, thick fur shielding them from the worst of winter's bite, their muscles lean and powerful beneath. Their eyes glowed in the darkness, sharp and predatory. Snow was too weak to flee. His ears barely twitched as the wolves advanced. A large male stepped forward, his grey fur streaked with battle scars, his breath visible in the freezing air. Hunger burned in his amber eyes. It had been days since the pack's last proper meal, and the deep snow had buried most of the smaller prey, leaving them with only scraps. The scent of fresh, vulnerable flesh had drawn them here. They needed food. A soft whimper escaped his throat, the moment before the kill. A female wolf lunged between them, her body suddenly barrier and shield. Her head lowered, teeth bared, not in hunger but in warning. The pack froze. Her fur was thick but dull with age, her body leaner than the others. Snow dusted her muzzle, her once powerful muscles slightly worn from time. She was not the strongest, nor the fastest, but there was something in her stance, a silent defiance that made even the lead wolf pause. A sharp growl rumbled from her throat, her tail raising slightly despite the cold wind whipping through her fur. The other wolves hesitated, ears twitching, muscles tensed. The lead wolf let out a low, guttural snarl, stepping forward once more, his breath heavy with irritation. This was not how things were done. The weak did not belong. Prey did not walk among predators. But the old female did not move. Her eyes, deep amber, flicked towards the small, trembling body half buried in the snow. She knew this kind of cold. She had seen bodies buried in it before. The wind shifted, bringing with it a ghost of a scent. Memories of lost warmth, of tiny heartbeats that had once pressed against her own. She had once stood over her own pups, sheltering them from the storm. She had once curled her body around them, fighting to keep them alive, and she had once, too, failed. The lead wolf huffed, shaking loose the tension in his shoulders. He circled slightly, waiting for the old female to move, to yield. She did not. Another growl from her throat, low and unwavering. The old female slowly lowered her head, her nose pressing gently against the pup's tiny ribs. A faint shudder. He was still alive, but barely. The lead wolf let out a short, sharp breath. A decision made. He flicked his tail once, a silent command, and turned away. The tension broke. The wolves that had been inching closer stepped back, though some lingered a moment longer, their hunger still gnawing at their instincts. But the hunt was over. The old female exhaled, her muscles relaxing only slightly. Snow did not stir, did not move, did not even realize he had been spared. She nudged him once more. He did not respond, but he was still warm. She would not leave him behind. His small body hung limp, his weight almost nothing to her. The wind howled once more as she turned away from the pack, padding silently through the snow, the tiny pup held carefully in her grip. The rest of the wolves watched her go. Some, like the lead wolf, would soon forget this moment, their hunger pushing away any questions of what had happened tonight. Others would remember. She disappeared into the storm, carrying the fragile life that had no place here, yet somehow had survived. The nights in the wild were cruel. The cold seeped through everything, turning breath into mist and fur into frozen needles. Snow, despite his thick coat, was not built for this world. His small body trembled against the icy wind, his paws buried in the snow as he curled into the warmth of the she-wolf who had saved him. She lay beside him, her large frame blocking some of the cold, her steady breathing the only comfort in the vast, merciless wilderness. Snow pressed closer to her warmth, too exhausted to do anything else. He did not yet understand why she had spared him, nor what his place was in this new world, but he would soon learn. The pack moved at dawn, their silent figures blending into the snow-covered trees. Snow stumbled as he tried to keep up, his small paws sinking deeper than the others, his breath coming in fast, desperate puffs. The old she-wolf, his only protection, stayed close, glancing back every now and then, her amber eyes watchful. The others did not share her patience. A young, lean male snapped at Snow's heels when he lagged behind. Another wolf, Fang, the largest and most aggressive of the pack, watched from a distance, his ears twitching with disdain. He did not need to bare his teeth or growl for Snow to understand. He was not wanted here. Snow kept his head low, pushing forward. He did not belong, but he could not leave. Alone, he would not survive. The first test came with food. Now they fed. Snow stood back, his stomach twisting at the raw scent of meat. He had never eaten like this before. The food Clara had given him had always been warm, soft, safe. But there was no kindness here. The wolves ripped into the carcass, muscles flexing, jaws tightening. Blood splattered the snow, steaming against the cold. The younger wolves fought for their share, shoving and snapping at one another. Snow hesitated. A low growl rumbled beside him. The old she-wolf nudged a torn scrap of flesh toward him with her nose. She had taken her portion and had chosen to share it. Snow looked at it, unsure. It smelled sharp, metallic. His stomach ached, but something inside him resisted. A sudden snap of teeth near his ear made him flinch. Fang stood just a few feet away, his golden eyes sharp with amusement. He had been watching, waiting. Snow understood. Hesitation meant weakness. The pup lowered his head and took a tentative bite. The taste was strange, raw, but the hunger inside him overpowered his instinct to reject it. The old she-wolf watched him closely, waiting for him to refuse, to fail. But Snow swallowed. She blinked slowly in acknowledgement. Fang, on the other hand, turned away with disinterest. Snow had passed the first test, but there would be more. The second test came with the hunt. Days passed and Snow learned to follow, to watch, to survive. The pack moved together, sleek bodies slipping through the trees like ghosts. Snow was smaller, slower, but he kept up, his paws learning the rhythm of the hunt. He could not chase like the others, he could not kill like them, but he could observe. He watched the way they moved, how they signaled one another with a flick of an ear, a shift of weight. They were not just wild beasts. They were something far more intelligent, something connected in ways he could not yet understand. But not all of them saw him the same way. Fang, especially, did not. The large wolf would shoulder him aside when passing, would circle closer than necessary when they rested. He never attacked, but he didn't need to. Every glance, every movement was a challenge. Snow understood. He was being tested. And then came the river. The pack stopped at the edge of a frozen stream, their breath curling in the frigid air. The ice was thin, the current strong beneath it. The wolves drank carefully from the banks, their weight keeping them safely on solid ground. Snow hesitated before stepping forward, feeling the icy slush beneath his paws. Then it happened. The ice beneath him cracked. For a brief second the world held still. Then, with a sharp snap, the surface shattered beneath his weight. Cold, a sudden, merciless rush of water engulfed him, stealing the breath from his lungs. The current yanked him downward, dragging him beneath the broken ice. The cold was a knife, cutting through him, squeezing his chest, filling his mouth and nose with bitter, suffocating cold. Snow flailed, kicking wildly, his paws scraping against nothing. The river pulled him deeper, ice closing in above him, the dark water swallowing him whole. Some stepped forward in curious silence. Fang did nothing. He simply stood there, his gaze unwavering, waiting. The message was clear: survive or die. Snow's vision darkened, his lungs burned, his body was shutting down. He thrashed with everything he had, claws scrabbling, pushing toward the flickering light above. His paws struck the edge of the ice, his nails finding grip, but his body was too heavy, too frozen. Then, movement. A blur of silver. The old she-wolf. She did not leap into the river. She did not pull him out with her teeth. She simply placed her weight on the edge of the ice, pressing down just enough to shift it, to create a ridge for him to climb. Snow kicked, dragged himself forward, his claws catching, pulling, until finally his head broke the surface. Air burned his lungs as he collapsed onto the frozen shore, his body shaking violently. He was alive. The old she-wolf stepped back, her ears flicking slightly in acknowledgement. Fang huffed, turned away. The rest of the pack followed. Snow lay there, his breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. He had survived, not because of instinct, not because he was a wolf, but because he refused to die. The winter pressed on, relentless and unforgiving, yet Snow endured. Days turned into weeks, and he grew stronger, his muscles no longer trembling from cold, his paws no longer clumsy in the deep snow. He could not hunt, could not fight like the others, but he learned. He could read the wind, scent danger before it came. He could follow the pack's rhythm, anticipate their movement, their signals, but he was not one of them. He did not run with their grace, did not understand their silence in the way they did. They accepted his presence, tolerated him as long as he did not slow them down. But he was still different. And deep inside, Snow knew it too. No matter how long he stayed, he would never be a wolf. The pack moved through the valley, their bodies blending with the silver mist curling along the snowdrifts. The morning sun hung low in the sky, pale and distant, doing little to warm the earth. Snow followed, as he always did, his nose to the ground, his ears twitching at every unfamiliar sound. Then a scent. It was faint, buried beneath layers of pine and frost, but it was there, something familiar. Snow froze, his heart suddenly pounding. He lifted his head, sniffing again. The others continued forward, unconcerned, but Snow's mind had already been pulled elsewhere. The scent curled through the air, igniting something deep in his memory. A place that was warm, safe. A home. And then it hit him, human. The realization sent a shiver through him. He hadn't seen another human since that night, since he had been left to die in the storm. His paws carried him forward before he could stop himself. The scent grew stronger, then voices. Snow's ears perked up, his body tensed. He crouched low, pressing himself against the thick underbrush, his eyes scanning the open stretch of land just ahead. And there they were, two figures, Jacob Miller and Gavin. Snow's breath caught in his throat. But the man beside him, he was different. Gavin. Snow remembered him, the way his hands had grabbed him, rough and uncaring, the way his voice had growled with hatred, the way he had tossed him away like garbage into the freezing night. Snow's body tensed, his hackles rising involuntarily. He had not forgotten, and from the way Gavin's cold eyes swept over the landscape, Gavin had not forgotten either. Jacob's voice broke the silence. Gavin let out a sharp breath, adjusting his gloves. "Then we keep looking. I told you I want this done." Jacob's expression hardened. He glanced toward the distant tree line, scanning the horizon. His fingers flexed against the strap of his rifle. Snow stayed hidden, but his ears twitched, listening. They were hunting something. His stomach turned, the wolves. Jacob sighed. "We don't even know if they're the same ones. Plenty of wolves in these mountains." Gavin scoffed. "I don't care which ones. I want them gone." His voice was sharper now, edged with something dangerous. "They took down livestock. They're getting too close." Jacob was silent for a moment, but Snow saw the tension in his shoulders. "I don't kill unless I have to," he finally said. Gavin's jaw clenched. He turned to Jacob, his voice lower, colder. "You owe me." Jacob didn't respond. Snow watched them carefully, his heartbeat a dull roar in his ears. He did not understand everything they said, but he understood the danger. Gavin was here for blood. His pack was in danger. Neither man noticed, but someone else did. A shadow flickered behind him, a familiar scent, a soft crunch of paws on ice. Snow turned his head slightly, and there she was. The old she-wolf, her amber eyes locked onto his. She had followed him. Snow's ears twitched. A silent understanding passed between them. Then, from deeper in the forest, another sound, a faint rustling, the whisper of movement. Snow did not have to look to know. The pack was watching, waiting. Would he stay with them? Would he return to the world he once knew? And he would have to choose. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and sweat. Snow crouched low in the underbrush, his ears twitching at every crunch of boots against frozen earth. His heart pounded against his ribs, his breath shallow, as he watched Gavin and the group of men move through the clearing. They weren't just here to track, they were here to kill. The scent of oil and metal clung to them, the unmistakable smell of guns, ammunition, and blood yet to be spilled. Snow's muscles tensed. His instincts screamed at him to run, to vanish into the forest like he had learned to do. But something deeper, something primal and unwilling to yield, kept him there. This was not just any hunt. This was a vendetta. Gavin walked with purpose, his grip tight on his rifle, his breath misted in the cold air, frustration and impatience written all over his face. He was tired of waiting. "Spread out," he ordered, his voice sharp, clipped. The men behind him obeyed, their rifles slung over their shoulders, boots leaving deep imprints in the snow. They were hunters, but not for sport. A reason to settle unfinished business. His boots crunched over frozen twigs, his eyes scanning the landscape. He didn't care about the money. He cared about revenge. He had lost everything that night. Clara, his pride. And somehow that damned dog had survived. And if there was one thing Gavin hated, it was losing. The hunters spread out along the ridgeline, their eyes trained on the snow-dappled valley below, a perfect hunting ground. Then a sound, a faint rustle from the trees. Gavin held up a hand, signaling the others to stop. His sharp gaze locked onto the tree line, fingers flexing over the trigger. The forest was silent, too silent. Then a shadow moved. Gavin's breath caught in his throat as a figure stepped out from the trees. For a second, he didn't understand what he was looking at. Then his pulse spiked. The dog. Snow emerged from the shadows, his coat no longer the soft, clean fur of a house pet, but roughened by the wild, his stance no longer uncertain but steady, aware. His golden brown eyes burned with something Gavin couldn't place, something that made his skin prickle. Disbelief flickered across Gavin's face. "No way," he muttered, lowering his gun slightly. "That's not possible." His mind reeled. He had watched that mutt collapse in the snow, had seen him fade into nothing. He was supposed to be dead. Yet here he was, a ghost of the past. And then realization hit him. If the dog had survived, that meant the wolves had taken him in, which meant... Gavin's lips curled into a slow, twisted smirk. "Well, well," he murmured, stepping forward. "Looks like you've finally learned your place, huh?" Snow didn't move. His muscles were coiled tight, his ears erect, but he didn't run. That alone made something uneasy coil in Gavin's gut. His fingers twitched over the trigger. "You should have stayed dead," he said flatly. He raised the rifle, and then everything erupted into chaos. The first wolf struck from the shadows, a blur of grey fur and raw power. It hit one of the hunters before he even had time to scream, sending him crashing into the snow. The second came a heartbeat later, a snarling mass of teeth and muscle, lunging for the closest man, knocking his rifle aside before his hand even reached the trigger. Then, from all sides, the pack emerged. Gavin staggered back, cursing loudly as the world around him erupted into chaos. His men shouted, scrambled, rifles swinging wildly, but the wolves were too fast, too well coordinated. They were hunters, and they had the advantage of their territory, their unity, their fury. Snow didn't hesitate. He darted through the madness, his eyes locked onto Gavin. For so long he had feared this man, feared his voice, his hands, the weight of abandonment in the snow. Not anymore. He wasn't the same weak, shivering pup that had begged for warmth. He had survived the wild. He belonged here now. Gavin swung his rifle, trying to track the movement, his breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. The confidence in his stance was gone, replaced by something close to fear. A blur of silver moved in front of him. The old she-wolf. She stood between him and Snow, her amber eyes burning with something ancient, something unbreakable. Gavin froze, and for the first time in his life he understood what it was to be prey. The attack lasted mere minutes. The hunters, outmatched and overwhelmed, retreated into the trees, their plans shattered. One of them had dropped their rifle in the scramble, their tracks leading away in wild, erratic lines. Gavin stood alone. His breath came ragged. His hands trembled slightly, his rifle useless at his side. Snow watched him, standing at the edge of the clearing. Their eyes met, and this time it was Gavin who ran. Snow did not chase. The forest was silent again, except for the soft crunch of retreating footsteps fading into the distance. Then, slowly, the pack turned to Snow. The old she-wolf stepped forward, her gaze heavy with something unspoken. He had stayed. He had fought. He had chosen. Snow lifted his head, and in the quiet hush of the winter morning, he knew where he belonged. The battle was over. The hunters had fled, their footprints scattered in the deep snow, their scent already fading with the shifting wind. The wolves did not chase them. There was no need. The pack had made its message clear. This was their land, and they would not be hunted. Snow stood in the center of the clearing, his breath coming in slow, steady puffs of mist against the cold air. The adrenaline still pulsed through his veins, but something deeper, more profound, settled in his chest. This was the moment he had been running from since the night he had been abandoned. The moment he would have to choose, and somehow he already knew the answer. A soft crunch of boots on snow made his ears flick. Jacob Miller stood at the edge of the clearing, rifle lowered, his eyes locked onto the German shepherd that had once belonged to his daughter. His face was unreadable, but his stance held no threat. Behind him, another scent, a softer, familiar one. Clara. She was standing a few steps behind her father, her gloved hands clutched tightly together, her face pale from the cold and something else, shock, disbelief, hope. Snow turned his head slightly, his gaze flicking toward her. For a long moment, none of them moved. Then Clara took a hesitant step forward. "Snow!" The sound of her voice sent a tremor through him. It had been so long, so many nights in the cold, so many days of running, surviving, learning how to exist in a world where nothing had ever been certain. But her voice was. Snow took a slow step forward, then another. Clara let out a shaky breath. She dropped to her knees in the snow, her arms outstretched, her lips trembling. "Come here, boy. Come home." Home. The word made something ache inside of him. He wanted to move, to run into her arms, to let her warmth wrap around him and erase the nights he had spent lost in the storm. But when he turned his head, the old she-wolf was watching. The pack stood silent behind him, their bodies still as the wind curled through the trees. They had not left. They had not turned away. The old she-wolf, her silver-grey fur ruffled by the breeze, stood closest. Snow met her gaze, and the weight in her amber eyes held him in place. She had saved him. She had fought for him, protected him, taught him how to survive. And now she knew he would leave. Her ears flicked, the only sign of acknowledgement, but she did not move. Snow swallowed hard. He stepped toward her, closing the distance, and pressed his head gently against her neck. She didn't nuzzle him back, didn't make a sound, but she stood still, letting him say goodbye. The other wolves watched, their golden eyes unreadable. Some shifted, their tails flicking low, uneasy. Others simply stood, waiting. The old she-wolf finally lifted her head and took a slow step back. Snow hesitated. Then, with one last look, he turned away, and this time they let him go. The walk back to town was quiet. Jacob led the way, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his expression tense but softened by something else, understanding. Clara never let go of Snow's fur, her hands gripping him as if he would disappear if she did. She hadn't spoken much, only whispered his name over and over, as if trying to convince herself that he was real. Snow walked between them, his paws light on the snow, but his heart heavy. Behind him, the forest stretched wide and endless, filled with shadows that had once meant danger, then family, then something in between. He did not turn back, but he knew. The old she-wolf was still watching, and somewhere, deep within the trees, a howl rose into the cold, fading sky. Snow lay curled up on the porch, his golden brown eyes half closed as the afternoon sun cast warm light over the farmstead. It had been weeks since he had left the wilderness behind, yet the echoes of the forest still lived inside him. He had traded the icy wind for the gentle warmth of a fireplace, the silence of the mountains for the soft hum of Clara's voice as she spoke to him, telling him how much she had missed him. He no longer slept beneath the open sky, but inside a home, a real home, the one he had once lost. And yet some nights, when the wind howled through the trees, he would lift his head and listen, because a part of him was still there, out in the wild. Life at the Miller farm had returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be. Jacob had never been one to show emotions openly, but his actions spoke louder than words. He had built a new doghouse for Snow near the barn, though the German shepherd rarely used it, preferring to sleep by Clara's bedside. He made sure the pup was well fed, tossing him scraps from dinner, even when Clara scolded him for spoiling him. Clara, on the other hand, barely let Snow out of her sight. She had wept the night he returned, burying her face in his fur, whispering apologies he didn't understand, but somehow felt in the way her hands trembled against him. She had lost him once. She wouldn't lose him again. But Snow had changed. He no longer barked at the rustling in the trees. He understood the language of the wild now. He no longer cowered from the cold. He had learned to endure it. And when he ran, stretching his legs across the open fields, there was a power in his stride, a grace that had not been there before. The wolves had not just saved him, they had made him into something more. One morning, as Clara sat on the porch with Snow curled at her feet, a distant sound made his ears twitch. A howl, soft, distant, almost swallowed by the wind. His body went rigid. He lifted his head, ears erect, listening. Then another howl. This one was familiar, low, steady, a voice from the past. Clara noticed his sudden stillness. "What is it, boy?" she asked, following his gaze toward the tree line. Snow didn't answer. He simply stood, stepping off the porch, paws pressing into the cool earth. Jacob came out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "Something wrong?" Clara shook her head, watching Snow's body tense. "I don't know. He's listening." Jacob followed the dog's gaze toward the trees. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of the wild, of pine and snow and something ancient. Then, just beyond the clearing, a shadow moved. It was only there for a moment, barely more than a flicker between the branches, but Snow saw her. The old she-wolf stood at the edge of the woods, her amber eyes locked onto his. She did not step forward. She did not call out. She simply watched. Snow's tail twitched. His body leaned forward, his heart pulling toward the past, toward the life he had left behind. But then Clara's hand brushed against his fur. He turned his head slightly, looking up at her. Her eyes were filled with something fragile, something unspoken, a silent plea, "Stay." Snow looked back at the trees. The old she-wolf blinked slowly, not in sadness, not in disappointment, but in understanding. Then, as quietly as she had come, she turned and disappeared into the forest. The connection was not broken. It never would be, but Snow had chosen his place. And so, as the wind carried the last fading echoes of the wild, Snow turned back toward home,